The service of Radio Algeria International. It's time for the news.
Hello there, and welcome to the English program of Radio Algeria International. The top stories of the news. The President of the Republic, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces and Minister of National Defense, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, chaired Wednesday a meeting of the High Security Council to examine the general situation prevailing in the country. In the burning Middle East spot, the Palestinian Foreign Affairs Ministry has called on the United Nations to classify the Zionist entity as an apartheid regime. And the head of the European Union diplomacy, Joseph Borrell, has insisted on the difference between the coups in Niger and Gabon, underlining that the latter, which toppled President Ali Bongo, followed elections marked by gross irregularities. These are the major developments, and now the news in detail from Radio Algeria International. This is Mohamed Barazwan reporting. First in our newsfile, the President of the Republic, Supreme Commander of the Armed Forces and Minister of National Defense, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, chaired Wednesday a meeting of the High Security Council to examine the general situation prevailing in the country, according to a press release from the Presidency of the Republic. In ministerial activity, the Minister for Vocational Training and Education, Yassine Merabi, said on Wednesday in Algiers that the sector was working to train a skilled workforce that meets the requirements of the national economy, highlighting the sector's role and its efforts to live up to the ambitions of the new Algeria. In the latest on Sudan, the armed conflict which broke out last April in Sudan between the Sudanese armed forces led by General Abdullah Abdulatif Ali Burhan and the rapid support forces of Mohamed Hamdawi Dagalo goes unabated, with its trail of victims and refugees and the consequences of the neighboring countries and the region as a whole. Said Bouazi harks back on the situation of refugees inside and outside this war-torn country.
The crisis in Sudan has forced more than 4.8 million people to flee their homes, including 3.8 million internally displaced persons and more than 1 million refugees, said the International Organization for Migration, IOM, in its latest humanitarian situation report. 4,874,558 people have fled their homes, the Geneva-based UN agency said, estimating that 3.8 million people, nearly 760,000 households, had recently been displaced within this Northeast African country. The number of displaced people has been observed in more than 3,400 localities across Sudan. According to the IOM, fighting has been reported between the Rapid Support Forces RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces in several states, and the capital Khartoum remains the scene of intensified violent clashes. In addition to internal displacement, the conflict has also forced 1,072,804 people to flee their homes to neighboring countries. The majority of arrivals were reported in Chad, 48%, Egypt, 26%, and South Sudan, 22%, the International Organization for Migration said, adding that more than two-thirds of the arrivals reported in these countries were Sudanese nationals, and around 30% were foreign nationals and estimated returnees.
Concerning Niger, United Nations officials have said that sanctions against Niger were blocking vital humanitarian aid such as food and medicines, saying that requests for exemption had been submitted to the ECOWAS regional bloc. In the Western Sahara file, units of the Sahrawi People's Liberation Army SPLA have carried out new attacks against positions of the Moroccan occupation forces in the Bakari sector, said the Sahrawi Ministry of Defense in its statement number 863. Let's shift now to the burning Middle East file. The Palestinian Foreign Affairs Ministry has called on the United Nations to classify this Zionist entity as an apartheid regime. The ministry underlined in a press release that horrendous Zionist crimes dominate the lives of Palestinian citizens and reflect an order system of fully fledged apartheid, particularly in occupied Al-Quds. Said Bouhazi has more details in this report.
In the so-called C zones, the Palestinian homeowner is prevented by the occupying force from disposing of his land, building on it, and benefiting from his resources, and his movements are restricted, said the Palestinian Foreign Ministry. In addition, the source continued, occupation soldiers and settlers attack Palestinians in these areas, while their homes or installations are demolished or vandalized in the worst forms of apartheid rule. The Palestinian diplomacy calls on the international community to assume its responsibilities to implement international law in occupied Palestine in light of the non-implementation of more than 1,000 resolutions adopted in favor of the Palestinian question in an odious form of double standard. In the same press release, it condemns the violations by the occupying forces and settler militias and their armed terrorist organizations and their crimes against Palestinian citizens, their land, their property, their homes, and their holy places. In another development, a Palestinian child was killed Wednesday evening after he was shot by Israeli police in the occupied city of Al-Quds, local sources confirmed. Zionist occupation police opened fire at Khalid Samer El-Zanin, 14, near the area of Bab al-Amud, seriously injuring him and leaving him bleed to death. The sources added that the child was in the train before he was assaulted by extremist settlers who later called the police, who came and opened fire at the unarmed child. Later, the Israeli forces raided the 14-year-old's family house in Beit Hanina, north of Al-Quds, ransacked it, and oppressed those who came to offer their condolences to his family before proceeding to detain his father, mother, sister, and brother.
In other news, on a visit to the Bria region in the east of the Central African Republic, a United Nations delegation has called on the international community to step up its support for vulnerable communities facing a food crisis. This appeal came at a time when the crisis in Sudan is worsening the living conditions of the population in the Central African Republic, said the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Aid Affairs. Still in the news, China has issued highest warning for Typhoon Saola as it nears coastline. At least 121 passenger trains are suspending services, and people are being warned to stay away from the coastline. Jim Selmedi has more in this report.
Forecasters issued a typhoon red warning on Thursday. China's National Meteorological Center said Saola, currently located about 315 kilometers southeast of Guangdong province, will move northwest across the South China Sea at a speed of about 10 km per hour, gradually approaching the coast of Guangdong, then slowly weaken in intensity. Chinese state media reported at least 121 passenger trains were suspending service, while people in coastal areas of southern China were being warned to stay away from the coastline. Saola will make landfall along the coast somewhere from Huilai County in Guangdong to Hong Kong on the afternoon to the night of September 1st. The center said, adding, with its forecasted intensity, it could be among the 5 strongest typhoons to land in Guangdong since 1949. As Saola approaches, Guangdong's Chengxing city said it would upgrade the typhoon warning level to yellow, the second lowest, and suspend classes at nurseries, kindergartens, primary and secondary schools. The typhoon is expected to hit China's southern Fujian and Guangdong provinces on Friday.
In other news, the head of the European Union diplomacy, Joseph Borrell, has insisted on the difference between the coups in Niger and Gabon, underlining that the latter, which toppled President Ali Bongo, followed elections marred by gross irregularities. More details with Mohamed Khatal in this report.
Naturally, military coups are not the solution, but we must not forget that in Gabon there had been elections marred by irregularities. Borrell said, adding that a rigged election could be interpreted as an institutional coup d'etat. Specifying that there were no plans to evacuate European citizens residing in Gabon, he insisted that the situation was calm. We don't see any risk of violence, he underlined from Toledo, Spain, on the sidelines of a meeting of EU foreign ministers. The situation is radically different from that in Niger, he insisted. It's worth noting that the coup leaders who put an end to the regime in power in Gabon on Wednesday, deposing outgoing President Ali Bongo Ondimba and triggering jubilant demonstrations across the country, have chosen as their leader the head of the Republican Guard, General Brice Oligui Nguema. General Brice Oligui Nguema was appointed as the country's transitional leader on Wednesday, shortly after the coup. General Nguema was earlier carried triumphantly through the streets of the capital, Libreville, by his troops. Meanwhile, the deposed President Ali Bongo has appeared in a video at his home, calling on his friends all over the world to make noise on his behalf. The former French colony is one of Africa's major oil producers. Mr. Bongo's overthrow ended his family's 56-year hold on power in the Central African state. Army officers appeared on TV in the early hours of Wednesday to say they had taken power. They said they had annulled the results of Saturday's election, in which Mr. Bongo was declared the winner, but which the opposition said was fraudulent. The officers also said they had arrested one of Mr. Bongo's sons for treason. The U.S. State Department urged Gabon's military to preserve civilian rule and urged those responsible to release and ensure the safety of members of government. While the UK condemned the unconstitutional military takeover of power, there has long been simmering resentment of the Bongo family. It ruled Gabon for almost 56 years, and there has been public discontent over broader issues such as the cost of living.
And finally, last piece of news. 6 members of the Ukrainian armed forces have been killed in an incident involving 2 helicopters while they were on a mission in eastern Ukraine. The military said that 6 Ukrainian servicemen were killed while carrying out missions in a Russian-held sector of the country near the eastern city of Bakhmut. You are still tuned to Radio Elder International, and now I invite you to listen to the second part of our audition with 2 timely broadcasts on schedule. I wish you a swell listening.
A story in an artwork. A weekly program that tells stories flavored with art.
Shabi or popular music in Algeria can be translated as Algerian portraits.
Yeah, Algerian portraits. It's about profile.
Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to our broadcast, A Story in an Artwork. Today's story is told in a revolutionary song that urged for action during the colonial period in Algeria. The song, Ashab al-Baroud, which can be translated into Armed Men, is today's story. Written and sung by Iran's poet Hawari Hanani, the poem Ashab al-Baroud is not a tribute to the horse riders who perform the Fantasia ritual, nor a festive love song as many artists perform it. The poem Ashab al-Baroud was released during the time of the celebration of the French colonization's centenary of Algeria in 1930. The one-year-long French celebrations of their 100 years of presence in Algeria was very provocative to Algerians, who witnessed a huge celebration that did not show any kind of consideration to the people of this colonized and oppressed land. The poem was neither a simple condemnation of the established colonial rule, nor a mere expression of the poet's position. It was an urge aimed at raising the people's awareness and a clear call to take up arms and pursue popular resistance. The poet says, "Swords pulled out and black bullets fired. There is no one to colonize the land and the people after 101 years." Hawari Hannani wrote the poem in Algerian plain dialect and made his message easily accessible to ordinary people. In the poem, he expresses his love to the homeland, hoping and expecting Algeria's recovery from the suffering of colonization. Ashab al-Barud, Hawari Hannani sheds light on the inner suffering of colonized people and their crushed spirit, emphasizing that words and condemnations will not end 100 years of colonization, and the only solution is taking up arms. He sings virtues and courage, pride and bravery during battles against the colonial army. The soft words of the poet became his only weapon to try to save his beloved motherland, whom he sees bleeding and sinking, while the French colonizer is strengthening its presence and oppression in Algeria. Hannani says to his homeland, "Your name is freedom, and you are very dear to me. You are the apple of my eye, and for you, my heart is broken." The poem spread and became sung at weddings and gatherings, and other Malhoun poets were requested by the people to perform it in different celebrations. The French colonial authorities then realized the significance of the poems Ashab al-Barud, which led to the arrest of the poet Hawari Hannani and the distortion of the words of the song to make it sound as a festive song suitable for wedding ceremonies, skipping all the verses that clearly urge the people to take armed action. History has proven that Hawari Hannani was right, and a common united action in the face of colonialism was Algeria's rescue from the French oppressor. The song Shab al Barud was also performed after Hawari Hannani by several Algerian singers. However, covers of Shab al Barud did not sing the original poem, given that it was edited several times and turned into a love or rhythmic song by many. A true revolutionary song, Shab al Barud undeniably remains popular and is a clear evidence of the power of sincere words. That's it, dear listeners, for our broadcast, A Story in an Artwork. Do join us next week for another story.
يا قلبي رواحي